in 2022, what some of the opportunities might be to progress those issues this year. The panel we have lined up is Dr. Shehnaaz Moosa from South-South North, the Director of South-South North, and she will give us an overview of the progress that's been made on climate finance, the quality, the quantity, and the composition of climate finance. We'll move then to Professor Saleemul, the Director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development, who'll give us an overview of what progress has been made on responding to impacts, adaptation, and loss and damage efforts, and where there are particular priorities for progress from this year. After Saleem, we'll move to Raju Pandit Chhetri, the Director of Prakriti Resources Centre, who'll give us an overview, particularly from an LDC's perspective, of what has happened and what needs to happen next on access to finance. After Raju, we'll turn to Nisha Krishnan, Director for Climate Resilience in Africa for the World Resources Institute, who will pick up the broader conversation around debt and fiscal sustainability, particularly for least developed countries and small island states, and how that impacts the capacity to take action on climate and development issues. We'll turn to you, to our audience, to ask a few questions of our panel, to bring your ideas into the mix on what needs to be done this year. And then finally, we will sum up with Clare Shakya, Director of Climate Change at the International Institute for Environment and Development, who will take some points from the panel discussions and from your ideas from the audience and give us a bit of a way forward, what needs to happen next on climate and development issues. To kick off very quickly with a brief overview of the political opportunity space this year, Alex Scott is my name from E3G. I direct our climate diplomacy and geopolitics team. And we really wanted to bring this conversation into London Climate Action Week, having recognized and started a really good conversation at London Climate Action Week over the last 4 years around these interlinked climate and development issues and the importance of addressing them together. We can't address sustainable development without addressing climate change and vice versa. Last year, as part of its COP26 presidency, the UK hosted a ministerial level conversation about these interconnected issues of climate and development. And the result of that was really setting forward a bit of a shift in the political agenda on recognizing the interconnection of these issues, and countries who participated in that ministerial process, supported by inputs and ideas from the fantastic think tanks and networks of non-government organizations in their countries, put forward really crystal clear ideas of what needed to happen on issues like climate finance, the quality, quantity, and composition, the accessibility of that finance, the efforts to address adaptation and loss and damage, and the underpinning of the wider fiscal sustainability, access to fiscal resources of these countries. And that agenda was sound. We have some summaries of that on the E3G website as well that you can take a look at. And we did see some progress. We saw some progress delivered over last year, a little bit of progress from COP26, and we're seeing a shift, an increasing shift coming from the political level. At the moment, we're seeing a lot of words, and we really want to see a lot more concrete action. And that's what our panel is going to talk through with you today. We'll have a really good overview of what has happened, but crystal clearly what needs to happen next. So I'd like to turn first to Shehnaaz from South-South North. Shehnaaz, could I ask you to give us your take on what progress has been made on the climate finance agenda and what needs to happen next? Over to you. apologies for the technical difficulties, everybody. Just double checking. Shehnaaz, can you hear us okay?
Sorry, yes, my Wi-Fi just went. Sorry, we have load shedding here. And so it's all these issues we need to deal with. So am I up now? Because I lost you there completely.
Yeah. You are up now. Yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing your take.
I'm sharing my screen because I've got a presentation that, and it's a quick presentation. So I'm Shehnaaz Moosa, a director at a not-for-profit called South North, based in Cape Town, South Africa. And all our work is in the climate change space and the knowledge brokering particularly. So what I'd like to touch on today quickly is just some of the progress on the climate finance quality, quantity, and composition, and some key priorities to progress this in 2022. So I think just to remind us that the recent IPCC report that came out has warned us that the world is set to reach the 1.5 degree level within the next 2 decades, that's 20 years, and possibly in all our lifetimes. Mobilizing and delivering climate finance has never been more urgent, and this needs to be done in a just, inclusive, and equitable way, and it can be used to transition economies to low emission and climate resilient development pathways. The 100 billion goal was meant to be met 2 years ago and sustained up till 2025, but efforts still lag both in pace and in scale. And importantly, the challenge is not only about the limited climate finance to developing countries, but also the poor quality and composition of such flows. So the fourth assessment report was launched during COP26, and it focused on global climate finance flows from 2017 to 2018 and included information on their geographical and thematic balance of flows. Key findings, so I'm just going to talk through the key findings from this diagram, include a 16% increase in global finance flows to an annual average of 775 billion over 2017 and 18. However, there is greater support for mitigation as opposed to adaptation. So in your bilaterals, it's 64% in favor of mitigation. In your multilateral climate funds, it's 48% in favor of mitigation. And with your multilateral development banks, it's 75% in favor of mitigation. So we see here that there's still a big gap to cover in terms of getting the quantities of funding to adaptation. So I just want to touch on the quality and composition of the climate finance. So there's several key shortfalls that continue to affect the quality and composition of climate finance. There's low levels and declining share of grant finance. So grants are a small share and not growing at the pace needed. Given its critical role in the climate finance architecture, grant finance should at least be doubled. There's underfunding of adaptation, as the data shows. So adaptation finance has been relatively neglected and is far from achieving a balanced allocation. Although adaptation finance increased more rapidly between 2016 and 18, its overall share in total public finance was only 21% in 2020. So significant capital will be needed to meet climate adaptation and resilience needs. I think we all know that there's a lack of adequate finance for LDCs and SIDS, and there's obstacles to access by developing countries to climate finance. So developing countries and entities within these countries continue to face obstacles in accessing climate funding. If we look at just accounting for the quality and composition of the climate finance gap is wider than the numbers are saying. So if you dig down, for instance, The lowest OECD report estimates that developed countries contributed $79.6 billion in 2019. However, Oxfam has calculated that once loan repayments, interest, and other factors are accounted for, the net assistance is only in the region of 19 to 22.5 billion per year. And this was for 2017-2018. Against that story of doom and gloom, there are opportunities and a few priorities. So I think the big opportunity is to increase adaptation and also mitigation finance. COP27 can be seen as this vehicle for immediate acceleration in the delivery of climate finance and actively setting a roadmap for ambitious post-2025 targets. Increasing adaptation finance to poor countries and support towards private financing efforts for just transitions. Private finance is by far the largest and primarily untapped pool of capital. So closing the gap in adaptation investment will inevitably require leveraging and crowding in of private finance. So when we're improving quality and composition of climate finance flows by addressing the shortfalls, which will enable developing countries to adapt more ambitious NDC and SDG goals. And so in closing, I think I just want to encourage adopting of a common understanding or definition of climate finance at a sectoral level that will aid in appropriately tracking adaptation and the mitigation finance, and thereby opening the space to crowd in more finance. With that, thank you. And I hand back to you, Alex.
Thanks very much, Shehnaaz. I think really clear messages on where there are particular gaps that could be addressed this year, the adaptation proportion, the grant proportion, but also picking up where there are opportunities to really start unlocking that untapped potential of private finance as well, and seeing COP27 as a crucial vehicle, not just for addressing some of those gaps in what's happening now, but also setting out what that roadmap looks like for the post-2025 climate finance goal and next steps there. Thanks very much for that. And a reminder to everyone, please do add your thoughts in the chat and add any questions to our panel in the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. We'll turn now to Saleem. Saleem, please give us your take on responding to impacts, progress and next steps.
Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you, Shehnaaz, for setting the scene. I'll pick up on where Shehnaaz left off and talk about two aspects of climate finance. The first one being adaptation, and the second one being finance for losses and damages, which are now unfortunately attributable to human-induced climate change that are taking place. So on adaptation, I would say COP26 was a relatively good news event where the developed countries acknowledged their inadequate finance for adaptation, as Shehnaaz has pointed out, and they all promised collectively to double the adaptation funding. So that's a good news story. We're still waiting to see that doubled amount of funding materialize, but I'll take it that they will keep their promise, and to reach the 50-50 level of adaptation to mitigation, which is now at a 20 to 80 level, which is totally unacceptable. And everybody agrees that. So the ambition to have half the funding go for adaptation and the other half go for mitigation is something that has been accepted. We need to now make it happen. There's an associated question on the adaptation funding, which I assume Raju might address, which is access to the funds. So even though there is adaptation funding available, the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries are having a very, very hard time accessing it. It has been almost inaccessible, I would say. And so we need to improve access. We need to make it easier for the most vulnerable communities and countries to access that. And that is an ongoing work in progress. Everybody acknowledges it, but we have not delivered the better ways of delivering that funding. There are pilots going around, all good to know, but they need to be scaled up as quickly as possible. The second aspect that is now unfortunately also on the table, now that we have impacts of climate change happening, as we hear from the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, there are victims of climate change around the world every single day. In fact, in the last few weeks in my country, Bangladesh, we had a 1 in 100-year flood. Although we have been very good at saving human lives, the loss of human lives has been minimized. Nevertheless, millions of people lost their homes, lost their crops, are stranded, don't have food at the moment. And this is a human-induced climate change magnitude flood. It has been exacerbated because of the global temperature rise, absolutely, credibly attributable. And these people need to be supported. And in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in COP26, the vulnerable countries asked for setting up what they then called the Glasgow Facility for Finance for Loss and Damage. But unfortunately, that was rejected by the developed countries. And in its place, they offered something called the Glasgow Dialogue on Finance for Loss and Damage. So they want to talk about it for the next few years. The dialogue has started a couple of weeks ago in Bonn. We had the first round of the dialogue. It was a good dialogue in my view. I attended, I was present, lots of good discussions, but we're not clear where they're going to lead. It seems to be like it was a glorified side event. We all lots of talk, but no decisions on what to do. In fact, in Bonn, the developing countries collectively, all the G77 and China countries, demanded an agenda item on COP27 on finance for loss and damage and didn't get it. But the good news is sense seems to have prevailed. In the last couple of days, the UNFCCC Secretariat has actually allowed a provisional agenda item to discuss finance for loss and damage in COP27. That is good news. I hope that that will take place and that we can move forward this agenda item on financing loss and damage from human-induced climate change, whose time has come. We cannot bury our heads in the sand and ignore it forever, which seems to be what the developed countries are still trying to do. They will need to take their heads out of the sand and do something about it. I'll stop there for now. I'm happy to take questions later.
Thanks very much, Saleem, and we look forward to digging into some of those challenges that you put forward there. Good to recognise some progress in commitment to double adaptation finance, even some progress in the decision-making process around the UNFCCC space, a provisional agenda item. We'll see where that goes. But it'd be good to dig into what can be done in the near term, as well as through those UNFCCC processes when we come to some audience Q&A as well. But picking up where you started with the issues of access to finance as one of the key interconnected challenges that needs to be addressed across the whole climate and development agenda. Can we turn now to you, Raju, and to pick up that access theme? What has happened? What's been good? What do we need to do next? Where are those major gaps that can be addressed, and how can they be addressed this year? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. And namaste to you all from Kathmandu. Good to be in this program. Well, I will just build on to what Shehnaaz just said, and also Saleem just pointed out some of the very key aspects. And of course, I will focus my very few points on the access part. Having said that, of course, just talking about billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in the climate negotiation is nothing until and unless the vulnerable people, the people who are suffering on the ground, the communities don't really get that. I think that is the fundamental part. It's not about numbers. Of course, numbers are important, but any numbers that is available at the international space, whether that really trickle down and flows adequately on the ground or not is a very fundamental part. So I will start from that basis. Now, just looking at some of the good points, what going forward is, at least in COP26, I think there was a very, good recognition that access to finance is a problem. that is also one of the reasons I think the UK and the Fiji led the group of a task force on access to finance, with outlining numbers of principles saying that it has to be country driven. This has to be like really based on the needs of the people, the flexibility and things and so on. I think that is a good thing. Of course, as Saleem said, doubling of the adaptation finance is also a good thing. Now, that is also good recognition. It's not just about commitment, but it's also recognition that there has been underestimation of the finance for an adaptation. The third part is also in several fronts we have been talking about how do you have the balance between adaptation and mitigation. Now, we don't only talk about those two pillars, but a third pillar. How do you start, looking at the loss and damage finance, which has not even begun until now. So we have to look into that part. So having said that, there are a few things that we need to really highlight. One, in this entire process, how do we build the confidence or the trust of the least developed countries and these small island developing states, which are the most vulnerable and also with the low capacity? I think that is a very fundamental and very key to really taking these climate actions forward, because it is linked with their poverty, it is linked with their existence, it is linked with their food security, everything is linked in peace, everything is linked. So I think that is a very fundamental part about building trust in order to, when you do the access to finance. Until and unless, now we see that these groups of countries have been promised a lot of things in the past. In 2001, there was, LDCs were told, you prepare NAPA's, National Adaptation Program of Action, we will provide you resources. It's been almost 21, 22 years now. Still, many of those NAPAs are still in the self-waiting for funding. That does not build trust. So I think, how do you really see that this resources, that is whatever is available, is flowing to these countries and are benefiting the communities is a very fundamental. The other thing is, as Saleem also very rightly pointed out, that adaptation has been undermined. And for LDCs and says, adaptation is very key. It's much more than what mitigation can lead to, because as I said, it's linked to poverty, addressing food security. There's a lot of other issues associated with it. Now, with these impacts of climate change, they'll even have to migrate and not be in their own communities, which is a very sad part. With that, now at the COP26, of course, there was adaptation fund, which was given almost $350 million. LDC were put in money. Even recent in Jeff replenishment process, there was given like about billions of dollars into that. But just allocating that money is not sufficient. So in terms of that, how does that flow into the countries is a very key part. And now, while I say that, I'll highlight a few of the things. One, it's about predictability. When I try and plan anything in my country level, am I being assured that the resources that I'm planning, or that I've been told that to plan and then the resources will flow, is that happening or not? Where is the money? Is that, will it come or not? Will it be like NAPA? We have prepared now NAPs, National Adaptation Plans. We have prepared NDCs. There's a lot of adaptation actions and others are good low carbon studies are associated with it. Will those be funded or not? That predictability has to be there. The other one is, now these countries wants to build the capacities in terms of institutions, in terms of human resources, in terms of how they utilize the resources for the need of the communities. And one of the things that they really want is through the direct access. They don't want always the other countries and other institutions coming and doing work for them. It is time that these countries themselves do work for themselves so that they can fulfill the needs of the communities. So it means the direct access to the resources that is available at the international fund is very, very key part. The other one is, now there are, many countries are developing their climate profiles and their project profiles are being developed, they're writing project proposals. But because of the historical data and evidences, many of the countries are not being able to access resources because they cannot justify the proposal that they have made that is due to the impacts of climate change. Now, climate rationale has been a big, big issue. I can give you an example in the Green Climate Fund to say many countries, the proposals are pending at the moment. They've said it like, this is what we need, this is the scale of funding we need, but because they cannot have those historical data to say that this is because of climate change, their projects are being held there. It's been like, you write a project funding proposal, it takes 5 years, 3 to 5 years. Once you put in a funding proposal, it takes years to get it approved and then again implement it. So by the time the whole context is changed from adaptation, as Saleem said, it's gone into loss and damage already. That no longer that particular funding proposal is irrelevant. So look at that side as well. So we have to really see, how do we help these countries at these initial stages? What kind of data are we really need? Of course, the good thing is now the GCR board is considering this climate rational and adaptation programming, and hopefully they will address this. But currently, that is not happening. The other part is also the harmonization and complementarity with other funds. Now, every funds are coming and every donors are coming with their own set of requirements. You make up, country programming for my fund, for GCF, or for ZEF, or for NDCs. A lot of things are happening. Just saying that technically you need to prepare this, you need to have this document, and not sufficient. In fact, the donors also are the development partners also need to support that bring it into a context where that can be looked from a bird eye view and then really support these communities on the ground. So I won't get too far, but my final point would be, there's been a lot of assessment on saying that maybe the private sector will come in and support this. In the LDCs and states, the private sector is not developed. We cannot handle that kind of, that institution is not being built. They will not do adaptation for us. It will have to be the public finance, which is still being very difficult, let alone all the complications with the private finance. That has to be really clearly understood how these resources are going to be really, flowing into the countries. Until and unless we don't really take these elements into account, access to finance for least developed countries and other vulnerable and poor countries will be exceptionally difficult, given their capacity, given their absorption capacity, given all the fiscal framework they have.
Thanks very much. I'm really looking forward to bringing you back in on some of those concrete ideas that you mentioned, areas where there could really be more progress this year, harmonizing criteria and processes for accessing funds, looking at direct access, but also some warnings to be thoughtful when we think about mobilizing private sector finance and reliance on private sector finance. Also, really useful to see you bringing in the interconnected issues around food security and poverty and the wider access to fiscal resources for broader challenges as climate impacts continue to hit, which is a great moment to bring in Nisha to catch us up on the progress that has been made. We had some great conversations last year around how we think as a climate community as well about the broader issues of debt sustainability and access to fiscal resources to deal with interconnected issues, including climate change. So great if we can turn to you next, Nisha, to come in on what we need to do next in that space.
Thanks, Alex. Just to maybe just give a little recap of where we are and where we need to go. First, I think we're all very aware that multiple crises over the last 2 years have really strained countries' fiscal positions, from dealing with the twin health, economic and health crises as a result of the pandemic, to a series of more severe climate-related impacts and frequent extreme events, and now the impacts of the war in Ukraine, both on food security as well as the economic implications of that. That is sort of the background going into this year and into this discussion around what adaptation finance and finance for loss and damage could look like. Most countries have exhausted their fiscal resources to keep their own economies afloat, and this has stretched countries' abilities to invest in both resilience as well as the transition, even if they're already mainstreaming climate into their own public decision-making. An increasing number of countries are in debt distress, and compounded by already high existing debt levels prior to the pandemic. The inflationary pressures that we're seeing in advanced economies are also prompting rising interest rates, making it even harder for some of these developing countries to refinance foreign currency dominated debt. Last year, we had several key asks, including issuance and reallocations of the special drawing rights, developing medium and longer term debt solutions that could help address the different crises facing us, including climate, nature, and debt together through nature debt swaps, or even establishment of an IMF and World Bank platform to systematically address these possibilities of swaps. We also asked, for example, for the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to do more with their capital that they have on their balance sheet, as well as looking into grants for climate vulnerable, middle income, and small island states. The last thing that we also did ask for is what a multidimensional criteria for vulnerability could look like, especially to access concessional finance. So we've had some early successes in addressing these key asks. but progress has stalled since then, and that needs to be worked on this year. First, I would wanted to sort of go over the fact that the special drawing rights were issued last year in August, providing about $650 billion to the IMF, which has since launched the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund in April of this year. And while these resources are available to countries to address climate-related as well as pandemic preparedness issues, its eligibility criteria may actually restrict access to countries, as it's based on countries' abilities to repay loans to the IMF, even at highly concessional rates, and already having a program of policy reforms with the IMF, which many countries are often not keen to do given the signals it gives to the market. Countries are, however, eligible to access up to $1 billion under this fund, and the fund is expected to be operational by October this year. So the jury is still out as to how useful this will be going forward and how many countries will actually take up these resources, given the other eligibility criteria associated with it. The IMF is actually only one of the institutions through which these SDRs can be recycled through. So it is imperative that we start to discuss how the international community can actually find other ways of recycling these SDRs through the World Bank or other regional development banks, for example. Second, we also pushed for and asked for the debt service suspension initiative to be extended till the end of last year, which provides for deferrals on official debt for countries, and about 73 low-income countries took this up last year. While it provided immediate liquidity support to help decrease the overall debt stress of vulnerable countries, it still needs to be revisited this year, given the continuing crises that we're facing, particularly as implications of the war in Ukraine drags on food security and economic services, as well as supply chain issues. At the end of the day, I just wanted to reiterate the fiscal space in many countries remains extremely limited, with debt levels rising and inflationary pressures further exacerbating the weak fiscal positions of countries all around. Climate vulnerable countries are stuck in a vicious cycle. They continue to face short and long-term climate impacts, are unable to adequately invest in their preparedness, and are thus experiencing irreversible losses and damages, and continue to need to borrow to address these impacts. This year's Climate and Development Ministerial, in our discussions in the lead up to COP, needs to systematically address the financial flows to countries, whether that's how we think about humanitarian assistance, mitigation, adaptation, as well as loss and damage. And it can no longer be divorced from how the macro financial stability of these vulnerable countries. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Alex to guide, and hopefully to the audience, and we can have a discussion about this. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nisha, and some clear instructions, I suppose, to ministers joining a Climate and Development Ministerial again this year. As we heard from the May UNFCCC Ministerial hosted in Denmark, the UK and Rwanda will be hosting another Climate and Development Ministerial this year in September, alongside the UN General Assembly, and they will pick up on these 4 themes that were the topics of conversation at last year's ministerial. So a concrete political level opportunity to get some of these areas of progress that you've all outlined really taken forward, to get ministers' attention on them, to get some new steps taken. So I'd like to turn to our audience and to our panelists to take forward a bit of a conversation about what could that one ministerial moment specifically help us unlock this year. So far, we've had a question from the audience asking about some of those pilots that Saleem, you mentioned, on improving access to finance, some examples of where the accessibility of finance has really been better. I wonder if I could bring you back in briefly to speak to that, and to think particularly what could Climate and Development Ministerial this year pick up from the examples of where there are some good practice accessibility criteria and modalities. Over to you.
So let me cite an example that my center in Bangladesh is providing with funding from international funders. It's it's called the Gobeshona. Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research. It's a platform for locally led adaptation and resilience actors around the world. And last year we had a global conference, the first global conference, and we had a second one this year. And we got some funding to provide small grants. These are $5,000 grants to local practitioners doing adaptation at the coalface, at the front lines. And last year we gave a set of these kinds of small grants, and this year they reported back on their activities, and this year we've given a number of more pilot grants as well. We hope this will continue. There are a number of issues regarding getting funding in small amounts to local level. The big global donor agencies simply can't cope with giving a few $1,000s to hundreds of people. They need intermediaries who can handle those kinds of funds and provide the fiduciary capacity to deal with them. So there are some international agencies like the UN Capital Development Fund, UNCDF. They have a program called LCAW where they are providing funding to local governments. These are local governments in different developing countries. There are similar programs by different philanthropy organizations. South North is doing some, IIED is doing some. So there are a number of pilot scale activities with different intermediaries who are trying to provide funding at a level that is useful and at a speed that is useful to the local communities. Those two are the key criteria. People need the money now, and they don't need huge amounts of money. They need a small amount of money, but they need it right now. And how do you reach it to them, and then how do you provide it to them in a timely manner with the due diligence that is required by the donors? So I'm not against having due diligence, but I am certainly in favor of having ways to provide due diligence in a timely and quick manner. Let me also mention one other example that I'm aware of, which is the NGO BRAC. BRAC is the biggest NGO in Bangladesh. As it happens, is also the biggest NGO in the world. And they have a big program, a climate bridge fund, where they have funding from the German government, which they are also providing in small amounts to local level communities in urban settings. So this is an urban climate adaptation fund in Bangladesh, but they want to expand it to other countries. So there's a number of these examples around. We need to learn from them and then build on them and expand them as quickly as possible.
Thanks very much, Saleem. Really useful to hear some of those examples. And Raju, I wonder if we could bring you back in, if you wanted to pick up from that thread and maybe give us a bit of an idea of, alongside some of the issues that you raised, what could a climate and development ministerial this year really do? What could make the biggest difference from ministers assembled together in September, addressing these issues around access, taking from some of the good practice examples, some of the capacity building, some of the outcomes of the Access Task Force that was launched from last year's Climate and Development Ministerial? What do you think might be the big difference that could be made this year?
Thank you very much, Alex. Like Saleem said, just let me also begin with one of the examples. Nepal has also very successfully piloted something called LAPA, Local Adaptation Plan for Actions. And this is something that has been done at the local level, where our development partner, UK government, has funded this project, especially to support the local governments, where they themselves make a plan, align it with the local fiscal budget, and then implement this work. There's some very good examples where the resources have really reached on the ground, though this is through the bilateral aspect. So building on that kind of thing. So I in my intervention earlier, I used a word called, trust, and also something called, it would be very familiar, something to relate with equity and fairness. So in upcoming climate and development ministerial, if the governments can really agree on these two terms: one, how to operationalize this trust building exercise with the developing countries, the groups like LDCs and SIDS. I think that is very key and fundamental. The other one is, when the bigger picture of climate finance is being talked about, how do you bring in the equity and fairness issue in it? So who gets the resources? like as in last COP task force on access to finance has really outlined those principles. How do we actually operationalize those on the ground? I think that is a very key aspect, talking from a broader aspect. But then in order to do that, one of the ideas that I would think is setting a set chunk of resources where a number of countries could directly access that and start having impacts. They could go through even let's say LDC fund, list developed country fund is there where that can happen. There's adaptation fund. Also, the process now where it's been very complicated with Green Climate Fund, how to have simplify that process. Of course, they even brought up something called SAP, simplified approval process for smaller projects. But then that still was so complicated. The LDC countries could just not access even those funds. So how do you simplify that? So if in the upcoming ministerials or the upcoming COP, if they could set aside a certain number of resources for a certain number of countries, and then actually deliver that immediately, like, in next year, something will happen on the ground. And countries do feel that, now what is being promised or what is being talked at the International Forum is actually being taken seriously on the ground. It's being implemented. I think that is a very key part to building trust and also looking at the fairness and justice angle. That's what I would think it from the broad context. But of course, now the people on the ground should feel the difference. The resources are flowing, which is not happening at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. A great reminder that the ultimate outcome we're talking about here is people on the ground really feeling that difference, but also some concrete examples from you on what could a ministerial this year really look at, a bit of a look at how those access principles are being operationalized and the idea of specific resources dedicated to direct access. Thank you very much for that. And I think one of the questions that would be good for us to bring out that could also be brought out in the ministerial itself, where there's a conversation between ministers, is looking at what the barriers are to making progress on some of these issues. And Shehnaaz, I wonder if I could turn back to you, and you gave us a great overview of particularly some of the numbers and where the gaps are and some ideas on what could be targeted next. Could I bring you in to give us your thoughts on what are the barriers to making progress on those areas that you mentioned? What are the barriers in different incentives for LDCs and SIDS and the rich countries? What are the blockers that you're seeing that ministers could really start addressing in a ministerial this year?
Yeah, thank you for that, Alex. I think if we look at it from a country perspective, I think the big barrier is actually the ability to access the money, so the finance, the funding. And I think a lot of them come with lots of very big transaction costs, which often make it impossible to like for countries to access. And then also I think some of them come with quite a few conditions. So often the funding is committed, but with that commitment, there's conditions that then become a political issue, and the communities that are most affected often get forgotten about while all these conversations are happening around how the transactions will happen, the sorts of conditions that go with it. And I think if those things can be unblocked, the finances can flow to where it's needed. And most of the time, it's your communities on the ground that are the most affected and the most impacted. So I think for me, that's the big thing that needs working on.
Thanks very much. And I think that's a good signal to send into ministers to take into that conversation this year. Nisha, I wonder if I could bring you in with a similar question. You mentioned some of the ways forward on addressing the broader access to fiscal resources that could be progressed by a ministerial this year or through other political processes. What are you seeing as the major barriers to getting progress on those issues that ministers and other political movements could really start unlocking?
I mean, I think in terms of barriers, in this year's sort of world, I guess, I think everyone is facing sort of the very constrained fiscal constraints, right? Whether that is Europe, the Europeans, in terms of the impacts on energy as well as food, and then for the rest of the world because of that. And so I think this year's CDM, Climate and Development Ministerial, has a chance to really address some of a longer term plan for how we might go forward on the debt issue, on the fiscal space issue. It cannot be a short term solution. It's not something that that we can do for a year and then sort of not hold some of these processes accountable. I think one of the first things is to hold the IMF Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund to its promise to deliver some of this finance. If $650 billion it can actually change the nature of what we do on adaptation as well as on mitigation and transition. So I think holding the Climate and Development Ministerial to set up an accountability mechanism that is outside of the IMF, and most of the Climate and Development Ministerial participants have a role in the IMF and the World Bank to ask for that accountability. The second piece, I think, is to, for example, build on the good news. Belize late last year, did a debt for nature swap, which wiped out about 10% of their external debt, which gives them quite a lot of resources to actually invest, for example, in marine conservation. What can we do to scale that up? Is there an actual platform and a coalition of actors between the IMF as well as the different regional banks that can really play a role in unlocking some of the stress on countries? And I think the third piece that we should also be really careful about, especially as we talked to ask these ministers to talk to the fund and the World Bank, is to not impose austerity as one of the ways out of debt stress, right? The understanding is that we need to invest in longer term capacities and longer term resilience of our countries. And that cannot come at the cost of also investing in resilience. And so I think that needs to be an integrated message as we go into this year's discussions. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks very much, Nisha. And we've got just over 10 minutes left of our discussion today. So I want to give each panelist a chance to come back in a final time before we turn to Clare to give us a wrap up. And we've had a question from the audience from Tim Cole, concerned about the political context, sucking a lot of energy out of these political moments and not seeing a lot of progress at each of the times that ministers come together. So a bit worried about where COP27 might leave us on this climate and development agenda. So picking up the question of, if you were to pick one issue that you would run a lobbying campaign around this year, that you would really get an outcome on, what would it be? And adding to that, what's your piece of inspiration that you'd give to ministers to really inspire them to deliver on your lobbying campaign? Shehnaaz, can I come to you first on the climate finance side? And you can't say access to finance because you already gave us that one last time. So what's your other one thing that you're really going to focus your lobbying efforts on this year, and how are you going to inspire ministers to bring it to the table?
Yeah. So I think what's important is for ministers to actually first then see how communities are and people, not just communities, are impacted by lack of climate action. And that lack is directly due to not having finance. So in the end, it's still access to finance. But I think it's important to realize how it's really impacting down the line people's livelihoods. And I think for the ministers to get that firsthand and to try and then change or inform the sorts of decisions and actions they are taking. And also that we're taking too long. It's now, time is up for talking. It's time for doing now. There's enough talking and talking about talking. So, and I think it's time for action, actually. Not just finance, it's time for action.
Great. Time for action, inspiring with the stories of what's happening on the ground. Get things moving on access. Let's go to you, Saleem. What are we going to do, particularly on adaptation and loss and damage?
Well, I've become a single agenda item person myself. I now do loss and damage. All right. To me, we have now entered the era of loss and damage. As I cited earlier, every single day, somewhere in the world, we are seeing the impacts of human-induced climate change in both poor countries and rich countries. And people are losing their lives, losing their livelihoods, losing their infrastructure, or losing their homes, and somebody needs to be helping them. So far, the UNFCCC has not done a damn thing except talk, as Shehnaaz said. However, in COP26 in Glasgow, not inside the UNFCCC, but outside the UNFCCC, we got the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, to actually put in £1 million at the beginning, and then she doubled it to £2 million at the end for specifically funding the victims of losses and damages from climate change. And she challenged other leaders to meet her. The province of Wallonia in Belgium stepped up with €1 million, and a number of philanthropies stepped up with a few $1 million in euros as well. So we have a small pot outside the UNFCCC. So far, Germany has given us €0. The UK has given us £0. Biden has given us $0. They need to be shamed into putting some money on the table.
A unique approach to inspiration there, Saleem, but good to reference the gauntlet being laid down by Scotland and some of the subnational governments there. So finance for loss and damage is your one lobbying campaign. Raju, can we go back to you? I think access has been a clear theme throughout the day today, but what's your one thing you're going to make sure is happening, and how are you going to inspire ministers to do it?
Yes, thank you very much again. Well, for the inspiration, I refuse to believe that the world leaders don't know about what's happening on the ground. In fact, if they say that they don't know, we're happy to host them and show them what is happening on the ground here. Very much welcome. Anybody who wants to come here in Nepal, I'm sure Saleem is willing to host in Bangladesh anyway. Just to put the thing in context, before the COP26, current COP President Alok Sharma visited Nepal. He went to one of the disaster-hit, climate-induced disaster-hit area in Nepal. He even made that into his opening remarks. He tweeted and did all this. It's not that they don't know. I think it's the lack of accountability and political commitment. And they can get away by just saying things, but they're not delivering it. They can do this year after year. That is the reality, present reality. But in order to really go forward at the Climate and Development Ministerial, and then really give a very good signal also at the COP27, would be that leaders really set aside a chunk of resources that goes to particularly to LDC and SIDS, and operationalizing as I said, about the principle that they themselves committed, saying that we will do this. We will work based on the country ownership. We look into the harmonization. We look into the needs of these countries. If they can really do, and then send back, almost like 46 LDC countries and about 43 SIDS countries home to say that now this is really coming. We're proud of it. Then I think that will be the success indicator, and that's where they need to work on. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I like that. The inspiration is the pride that we can have at the end when the access issues are addressed and some of those harmonization opportunities are advanced and the principles are implemented. We can take pride in having made a real difference this year. Nisha, can we turn to you? What's your one thing, and how are you going to inspire them to deliver?
So my one thing is actually not probably about debt and fiscal space, but actually about access. So to go back. But I think that, at the crux, regardless of whether it's about debt or whether it's about grant finance, it is really about access. So that's the fact is that, and it's not because procedures are complicated to access, but it's just that countries are also at max capacity in trying to access, right? You have very few individuals within governments who are trying to do multiple things. And I think one of the things that is the hardest to really grapple with is the fact that they have to do that across multiple funds, across multiple sources. And the timeline for actually dispersing those resources are so long that it doesn't really impact anything on the ground. So I think one of the things that I would really like to talk about or to see happen this year is the reduction in complexity in access, right? It isn't necessarily that, and the complementarity sort of question, I think, is the part that we really need to push. And one of the things that I've actually, at least over the last couple of months, on the sidelines watching some of the work that you're doing with the Champions Group on adaptation finance, I think is something that we could look to as an inspiration, right? These are potentially donors with some muscle who are rolling up their sleeves to figure out how we might reduce that complexity in conversation with others. And so I think that is something to look forward to. And if we could hold that as part of the transparency and accountability that Raju was talking about, I think we might actually have some progress this year. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Nisha. So Claire, over to you. What have you taken from the panel? What are we going to do next? Please close us out from the webinar today.
Well, thank you all so much. I have to say that was I was inspired. Okay, so the storyline is access, 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 and that we need to make climate impacts on people's real lives and livelihoods real for the ministers, whether that's visits to Nepal, Bangladesh and South Africa, or whether it's through a really sharp focus on transparency and who's getting the finance. Because as Shehnaaz pointed out, the balance isn't right. Mitigation is still getting the lion's share, grants are reducing, and that the processes, as many of our panel spoke to, around access of due diligence, the huge transaction costs and conditions that are being imposed on countries that are trying to cope with the impacts of climate change that they did not cause. So Saleem called for pilots being insufficient, but we need to see real scale support dealing with these compounding impacts. And he also spoke about shaving the laggards, and I think we probably do need to do that. And I suspect that courts will be setting prices through the year of what, we continue to see the courts actually playing quite an interesting role. One of the questions, in fact, was around the fact that the US courts, federal courts, have not have not provided a tool for the US government. But I think we need to use every tool in the toolbox, and the courts are not the only tool. But citizen cases being taken to courts is actually a very interesting area to set the price and to sort of try and shame the laggards, try and push people into a sense that action is absolutely required. I loved Raju's point that finance should only count if it gets where it matters. I think we need to start to frame what that actually means. The points around trust and fairness that he raised as well, but I think everyone was saying simplified access, deliver in a year, build accountability, build transparency, build complementarity, and focus on the national domestic systems, not the intermediaries. There are some inspiring ideas around the nature and climate debt swaps. Thank you for that, Nisha. I think a very important point about not imposing austerity in response to debt crisis. So that's really talking about rewriting the rule book. We're saying actually development needs to happen differently now, and that means a different set of responses. And then very finally, I think I think what we need is leadership that is coherent and authentic, and anything that doesn't meet that bar needs to be called out. So, we need to meet the promises of 0.7 for development finance. We need to see new and additional finance. That has been promised. We are not seeing it. We're seeing things going in the opposite direction. We need to call out, even when they're COP president, those that cut their 0.7 to 0.5, those that in fact take underspend from their spending on climate finance in Africa and send it to Ukraine. What underspends? They cut climate programs. What are they talking about? That was underspend. That was needed money in Africa that didn't get sent. So we need to get brave and call these things out. I think we have a really exciting agenda, and I would invite everyone that's joined us today to continue with us on this journey. I think there will be further moments in the year that we'll be really trying to sort of hone this story and really put the climate and development ministerial for this year under with a very high expectation of what they need to do to convince us of their leadership. Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you to our brilliant panel.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you all. Be brave and meet the high expectations that we have of you. I love that as a final message. Thanks, everyone, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.